The gavel hadn't even cooled from its last strike when William Barr leaned forward. His face flushed crimson, his voice erupting like thunder across the chamber. "That's enough." The words cracked through the air, sharp as a whip. Papers rustled, aides froze, and cameras zoomed in as though they had smelled blood. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. This wasn't just a routine exchange between a former attorney general and a congresswoman. No, this was a rupture, a moment when power tried to silence truth, when authority demanded submission. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her posture was steady, her gaze unshaken. Where others might have recoiled, she leaned into the silence Barr had left in the air. Her eyes locked on him not with anger, not even with disdain, but with a calm intensity that said, "You don't scare me." Gasps rippled through the room. Some in the audience glanced nervously, others smirked with anticipation. It was as if the chamber itself realized this wasn't going to end the way Barr thought it would. He had slammed the desk, he had raised his voice, but in doing so he had revealed something raw: desperation. And desperation in politics is like blood in the water. The cameras lingered on Crockett, her hands folded, her voice unspoken but already louder than Barr's outburst. For a man who once carried the seal of the Department of Justice, the command had been clear, absolute, the kind that once stopped entire rooms cold. But here, against her, the order felt brittle, hollow, almost like the last stand of a giant who suddenly realized the ground beneath him was shifting. Viewers at home leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by the sheer imbalance of it, all the roar of a man accustomed to obedience colliding with the quiet strength of a woman who had spent her career refusing to bow. And Crockett's silence in that moment wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She let his voice hang heavy, let the echo of his command reveal its own arrogance. Then, slowly, deliberately, she prepared to speak. But what came next wasn't just a rebuttal. It wasn't even just defiance. It was something larger, deeper and answer that would ripple far beyond that room. Because Crockett's reply wasn't just defiance, it was history in the making. William Barr was no ordinary opponent. He wasn't just a red-faced man shouting across a chamber. He was the former Attorney General of the United States. It's the loyal shield of Donald Trump, the architect of silences. Time and again, Barr had played the role of gatekeeper, using his mastery of legal maneuvers and commanding presence to bury inconvenient truths, to stall congressional oversight, to reduce fiery hearings into controlled narratives. His voice carried the weight of the establishment, the kind of authority that had intimidated even seasoned lawmakers. So when Barr slammed the desk and barked, "That's enough," the words weren't just directed at Jasmine Crockett, they were aimed at the MHSO, the very idea that someone like her could challenge the fortress he represented. In his mind, it was supposed to end there. Barr was used to shutting doors with a single phrase. He believed power was performance, and performance was domination. But Crockett's presence disrupted that old order. She wasn't simply another voice at a table stacked with microphones. She carried with her the stories of communities who had been dismissed, disregarded or dismantled by the very policies Barr had defended. Where Barr stood for establishment control, Crockett embodied the insurgent truth rising from the grassroots. And in that moment, every viewer knew this was more than an argument. It was a collision between eras. The stakes couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't just about a heated exchange in a hearing room. This was about who America allows to speak and who America allows to silence. Was the future still dictated by men who thought volume equaled validity? Or would it belong to voices who refused to be erased? Voices sharpened by struggle and unshaken by intimidation. Viewers at home felt that question in their bones. For progressives, for immigrants, for every person who had ever been told to sit down and be quiet. Crockett was more than a congresswoman. She was a vessel of resistance. Barr's shout wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. And the nation was watching to see if truth could withstand a command from power. Reporters scribbled, cameras zoomed, and social media began buzzing in real time. Clips of Barr's outburst were already circulating, framed with captions like, "Who really had enough?" And is this how democracy works? The narrative wasn't fixed yet. It hung suspended, waiting to be defined by what came next. And that's where the tension sharpened. because Barr believed he had delivered the final word, the authoritative punctuation. But Crockett knew better. She knew silence after his roar wasn't submission, it was the setup for something larger. Her calm was not compliance. It was preparation. As the audience held its breath, as America leaned closer to their screens, the battle lines crystallized. Establishment arrogance versus rising truth, silencing command versus unflinching defiance. And the outcome would say more about the country's future than either of them could admit aloud. What happened next rewrote the power dynamic on live TV. William Barr had long been cast as Washington's bulldog. To his allies, he was the steady-handed man who knew the corridors of power, who could twist the machinery of law into a shield for those he served. To his critics, he was something far darker, a master of manipulation who bent the law until it bowed to politics, who treated oversight as an inconvenience to be swatted away. His legacy was stitched, not with impartial justice, but with the stains of loyalty. To Donald Trump and the project of silencing dissent, Barr's tenure as Attorney General was marked by calculated defiance. When the Mueller report threatened to crack open the Trump administration, Barr stepped in not as a neutral interpreter of justice, but as its filter, releasing selective summaries designed to downplay corruption and blunt accountability. He became the man who turned complexity into camouflage, protecting power under the guise of legalese. Where others hesitated, Barr projected certainty. Where truth sought air, Barr suffocated it with delay redactions and dismissive smirks. And Congress knew it well. Time after time, when he was summoned to testify, Barr's reputation preceded him. He wasn't the type to crumble under questioning. He thrived in the performance of confrontation, treating hearings not as forums of accountability, but as stages for control. Lawmakers would ask sharp questions, and Barr would respond with a weary grin, a shrug, or a sharp legal deflection. It wasn't simply what he said, it was the way he said it, with an air of unmovable authority that suggested the hearing itself was beneath him. Journalists described him as unflappable, even arrogant, but arrogance was his weapon. He knew the performance of bluster could unsettle opponents, that raising his voice or cutting off a line of inquiry could tip the dynamic in his favor. When he barked, "That's enough," at Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't an improvisation, it was a tactic honed over decades. He relied on dominance the way some lawyers rely on precedent, consistently, methodically, with predictable results. But behind the image of immovability lay contradictions. Barr often cloaked himself in patriotism, claiming fidelity to the Constitution. His actions routinely betrayed that promise. He spoke of law and order, even as he dismantled oversight mechanisms designed to uphold it. He declared himself a guardian of justice, even as he shielded the powerful from its reach. This duality, patriotism and rhetoric, partisanship and practice, was the fault line in his persona. His critics never forgot it. Civil rights leaders called him dangerous, not because he raised his voice, but because he used his office to muffle theirs. Legal scholars described him as an institutionalist only in appearance, willing to hollow out the very institutions he pretended to protect. And ordinary Americans saw him less as a servant of justice than as a loyal soldier in Trump's army. Someone who put power above principle time and time again. Barr, however, believed in his own strategy. He believed hearings were contests of stamina, where he could outlast opponents with interruptions, technical jargon, or sheer force of tone. To him, the chamber was a battlefield, and his role was to dominate. Few had dared to pierce that armor. Few had looked him in the eye and refused to yield when he tried to silence them. That is why this clash mattered so deeply. Barr's command, "That's enough," wasn't just a reflex. It was a declaration of authority, a reminder of all the times he had cowed rooms into submission. But authority only works when others accept it. And for once, Barr's opponent was not intimidated. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She had faced worse than bluster. She had fought battles not just in courtrooms, but in communities where voices were systematically erased. She recognized Barr's tactic for what it was, the arrogance of someone who had always believed his power was absolute. And so the stage was set. Barr carried into the chamber his reputation as an immovable bulldog, his history of silencing oversight, his belief in the supremacy of his voice, He expected the familiar outcome: submission, retreat, or compliance. But arrogance meets its match when truth won't be silenced. Before Jasmine Crockett ever sat beneath the harsh lights of a congressional hearing, she stood in crowded Texas courtrooms defending clients the system had already written off. She wasn't born into privilege, nor did she inherit a gilded path to power. Her rise was forged in the grit of the courtroom, in the constant pushback against prosecutors who seemed to wield the law as a weapon rather than a shield. Those early battles shaped her voice, not a voice designed merely for debate, but one tempered in the fire of injustice. Sharpened against the grindstone of resistance, Crockett built her reputation on the side of the people who were too often silenced. The single mother, fighting eviction, the young man facing trumped-up charges. The immigrant targeted because of their accent or skin color, these weren't just cases to her. They were people whose dignity was constantly under assault. Every time she stood to argue before a judge, she carried the weight of those silenced voices. And in those moments, she learned a vital truth: power respects persistence. The courtroom was where she discovered that calm determination could dismantle bluster. That preparation could outmaneuver arrogance. And that courage could break through intimidation. Her style wasn't loud for the sake of volume. It was precise, deliberate, unyielding. Colleagues noted how she would wait until the opposition thought they had one, then deliver a point so sharp it left the room stunned. She embodied the kind of advocacy that didn't just defend, it exposed. Exposed hypocrisy, exposed contradictions, exposed the quiet injustices woven into everyday systems. That skill became her signature. As she transitioned from local advocate to state legislator and eventually to the halls of Congress, Crockett carried with her the lessons of those battles. She knew how institutions worked and how often they failed. She knew that the same tactics used to silence her clients in Texas courtrooms were used on a grander scale in Washington hearings. Where others saw procedure, she saw patterns of suppression. Where others felt intimidated by titles and traditions, she recognized familiar power plays. Her entry into Congress was not just political. It was personal. She represented more than her district. She represented every community that had ever been told to wait, to be quiet, to settle for less. She walked into the chamber, not as a rookie, desperate to fit in, but as a seasoned fighter who had already gone toe-to-toe with systems designed to crush the vulnerable. That background made her dangerous to those who relied on intimidation to maintain control. Critics often underestimated her. They mistook her youth, her accent, her identity as a black woman from Texas, as weaknesses to be exploited. But Crockett turned each of those so-called disadvantages into strengths. Every time she was doubted, she grew sharper. Every time she was dismissed, she grew louder. Every time she was underestimated, she grew stronger. Her rise was not an accident. It was a response to a world that kept daring her to quit. And so, when she faced figures like Bill Barr, she carried more than her own determination. She carried history. She carried the voices of women who had been shouted down in hearings before her. She carried the stories of black lawyers who had been told to know their place. She carried the struggles of immigrants, workers, and families who had no seat at the table, but whose lives were shaped by the decisions made in rooms like this one. She was not just speaking for herself, she was speaking for all of them. That emotional weight infused her presence with undeniable power. It wasn't simply about facts and figures, though she always came prepared with those. It was about something deeper, a refusal to let arrogance masquerade as authority. She knew how bluster operated, and she knew that silence in the face of it was complicity. That belief became her compass in every debate. For Crockett, confrontation wasn't about spectacle, it was about survival. She had learned early on that when power tells you to be quiet, it isn't asking politely. It is demanding submission. And submission to her was never an option. In Congress, she brought that same fire. During hearings, when others avoided tension, she leaned into it. When others softened their questions, she sharpened hers. She had no interest in preserving the comfort of the powerful. Her only interest was in amplifying the truth. In truth, when spoken clearly and boldly. had a way of unsettling those who relied on dominance to keep control. That is why the moment with Barr carried such weight. He wasn't just another opponent across the table. He was the embodiment of the very forces Crockett had battled her entire career, forces that silenced, dismissed, and controlled. For Barr, telling someone that's enough was a way of closing the book, shutting down the story, ending the fight. But for Crockett, those words were fuel. They echoed every attempt to silence her and the people she represented. They were the trigger for the very defiance that defined her career in that chamber. Her calm eyes, locking onto Barr's red-faced fury, carried decades of struggle, resilience, and defiance. She wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for millions who had been told to sit down and shut up. And as the room held its breath, it became clear that same fire was about to answer Barr's command. The air was already tight when Barr leaned forward, voice heavy with authority, and growled again, "That's enough." His tone wasn't just dismissive, it was meant to dominate, to impose finality on a woman he believed had overstepped. The words ricocheted through the chamber, his allies on the panel smirking as though the fight had already been settled. For decades, Barr had thrived on this tactic, intimidation as punctuation. But Crockett didn't flinch. Her posture stayed steady, her eyes unwavering, her voice carrying the weight of composure. She resumed her statement as though his outburst hadn't happened, her cadence measured, her words deliberate. It wasn't that she ignored him, it was that she refused to give his bluster the victory of silence. Barr interrupted again, now louder this time. "Congresswoman," I said, "that's enough." His hand slammed against the table, his face flushed with irritation. For a moment, the sound swallowed her words, and the room seemed to tilt toward his side. His allies chuckled under their breath, eager to watch him crush a challenger they deemed beneath him. Yet Crockett pressed forward. She adjusted her tone, not raised, not frantic, but firm, clipped, impossible to ignore. Every syllable she delivered was a refusal to yield. The tension grew with each exchange, like two storms colliding, lightning flashing in the pauses between their words. Observers leaned in. Conservatives in the audience and online were quick to rally behind Barr's interruptions, hearing in his bark the echo of the order they craved. Progressives, however, were silent, suspended in the tension, holding their breath as if willing Crockett's resolve to outlast his fury. And outlast she did. With each attempt Barr made to silence her, Crockett's poise deepened. His snarling interruptions contrasted with her calm sharpness, a duel of noise versus clarity. He wanted the image of control. She embodied the substance of it. That contrast did not go unnoticed. Cameras captured Barr's reddening face, his jutting jaw, his repeated refrain of enough. They also captured Crockett's steady eyes, her refusal to be diminished. Her every word slicing through his bluster like steel through fog. The longer it dragged on, the more obvious the split became. Barr supporters felt emboldened by his display of force, applauding the performance of power. Yet even some onlookers who once admired his toughness began to squirm at the spectacle of a man who couldn't. Stop shouting down a woman who refused to be cowed. His power looked less like strength and more like desperation. Still, Barr pushed harder. He leaned across the table, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're out of line. You've had your say. Sit down." It was a command, the kind he had issued countless times to subordinates, witnesses, and adversaries. But this was no subordinate. This was no ordinary witness. This was Jasmine Crockett. She didn't sit. She didn't stutter. She didn't stop. Instead, she pushed through, her words now sharper, her presence undeniable. Each sentence landed like a hammer, each fact delivered with the authority of lived truth. Each pause filled with the unspoken defiance that told Barr, the nation, that she would not be silenced. The spectacle grew unbearable for some. The chamber was split, energy crackling like static. On one side, Barr's defenders applauded his bark, desperate to see her fold. On the other, her supporters sat at the edge of their seats, knowing the history carried in her defiance, praying for the moment her voice would cut through his noise. and that moment arrived. Barr, convinced that he had worn her down, threw one last interruption. His voice booming with the confidence of someone who believed victory was within his grasp. He sneered, "That's enough, Congresswoman. You've embarrassed yourself." The smirk crept across his face, his allies nodding in approval, certain the exchange was finished. To them, this was the crushing blow, the line that would end her challenge, humiliate her into silence and restore Barr's dominance. But they were wrong. Because in that instant, Barr hadn't ended the fight, he had set the stage for what was to come. And then came the moment. Barr thought he'd crushed her, but instead, he set the stage for his own undoing. The chamber hung heavy with Barr's final sneer. "That's enough, Congresswoman. You've embarrassed yourself," his words, drenched in the arrogance of someone too accustomed to unchecked power, echoed like the gavel of authority. His allies leaned back in their chairs, smug with satisfaction. They believed the duel was over, but it wasn't. Jasmine Crockett let the silence stretch. Her eyes never left Barr's. She didn't rush, didn't flinch. And then, with a voice low and steady, she began. "Mr. Barr, what's embarrassing?" she said. Her tone cool as glass, is when men in power think shouting is. A substitute for truth. The room shifted, a ripple moving through the crowd as the tension pivoted. Barr's smirk faltered just slightly as Crockett leaned into the moment. She continued, her cadence deliberate, each sentence a nail driven into the coffin of his authority. "You want to tell me that's enough? Let me remind you, this chamber is not your courtroom. You don't dictate who speaks here. The people do. And I am here because the people sent me, those same people, silenced by the policies you defended. Those same families you ignored while covering for a president who thought power was his birthright." The sting landed. A few audible gasps fluttered across the room. Barr's jaw clenched, but for once, he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Crockett pressed on, her words sharpened with history. "You called oversight harassment. You dismissed the separation of powers as an inconvenience. You told America that truth was whatever protected the man in the Oval Office. But let me tell you something, sir. Truth is not yours to bend. Law is not your weapon to wield. And power, real power, belongs to the people you tried to silence." Every word carried more force, like a crescendo rising towards something unstoppable. She shifted from history to the human cost. When mothers were torn from their children at the border, you said it was lawful. When communities cried out for justice, you told them to wait. And when democracy itself trembled, you stood between accountability and the man who betrayed it. So don't you dare tell me what's enough. The chamber crackled with electricity. Barr's face flushed deeper, yet his lips stayed pressed tight. He knew interrupting now would only confirm her point that all he had was bluster. Crockett had trapped him in a paradox. Silence was surrender, but interruption was exposure. And she wasn't done. "Generations of Americans have heard men like you say that's enough. You said it to women demanding a voice. You said it to civil rights leaders demanding equality. You said it to immigrants demanding dignity. But every time, that command failed, because the truth cannot be ordered to sit down. And I, like those before me, will not sit." The room erupted in murmurs. Phones tilted up, recording every second. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even some who had laughed at Barr's dominance moments earlier now leaned in, sensing history crystallizing before their eyes. Then Crockett delivered the blow that shifted the ground beneath the chamber. She raised her hand slightly, commanding silence with nothing but presence. "Mr. Barr, I am an elected representative. My duty is not to shield men like you from discomfort. It is to speak for those who cannot be heard. And if my words make you pound the table, then maybe it's because the truth still rattles you." A pause followed, long, sharp, unbearable. Barr stared at her, his mouth half open, but no words came. The man who once bulldozed hearings with sheer bluster now found himself pinned in silence. And then it happened. Applause broke out, not in a slow build, but in a wave gasps. Cheers, claps echoing against the walls. The chamber had seen fiery exchanges before, but nothing like this. A moment where the bully was stripped bare by calm, unshakable truth. Phones lit up like a constellation. capturing the exact second Barr's authority cracked under the weight of Crockett's defiance. The look on his face stiff, red, his smirk now a grimace was frozen on every screen in the room. It was the look of a man realizing that power had shifted. Crockett didn't bask. She didn't gloat. She let the applause swell and fade before adding one final cutting line. "So, no, Mr. Barr, I won't be silent. Because silence in the face of abuse is complicity. And I wasn't elected to be complicit." The chamber held its breath. Barr's allies, once smugged, now shifted uneasily. The spectacle had flipped. What began as his attempt to humiliate her had turned into his public unraveling. Across the room, whispers spread. "She owned him. Did you see his face? This will be everywhere tonight." And they were right. In that moment, a viral clip was born. Within minutes, staffers and journalists were already typing, tweeting, sending footage to editors. The hashtags were inevitable. The reaction was undeniable. Barr sat back in his chair, deflated. He had shouted, he had pounded, he had commanded silence, but Crockett's calm fire had cut through every defense. And now, with the chamber roaring in approval and the cameras capturing his defeat, he looked less like the immovable bulldog of Washington and more like a relic, undone by the very arrogance that once sustained him. Crockett gathered her papers, her composure unshaken. She hadn't just answered Barr. She had dismantled the myth of his authority. Piece by piece, she had turned his weapon bluster into proof of his weakness. And as the applause gave way to an electric hush, one thing was clear. The duel was over, and the victory belonged to her. But the story wasn't finished. Because the real explosion wasn't in the chamber, it was in living rooms across America. The chamber's walls could barely contain the roar of Crockett's reply. But it was nothing compared to what happened once the clip hit the outside world. Within minutes, Twitter lit up like a wildfire. One hashtag rose instantly. Hashtag THATS, enough, the very words Barr had hurled, now flipped into a badge of defiance. Alongside it, others caught fire. Hashtag Crockett clapped back. Hashtag Barr shut down. And a flood of memes that transformed the showdown into a cultural moment. By the first hour, the clip had been uploaded to TikTok, where creators stitched it into reactions of stunned silence, exaggerated gasps, and laughter at Barr's reddened face. Young activists captioned it with lines like, "This is how you shut down a bully." By the end of the day, those short clips had been viewed tens of millions of times. Instagram Reels replayed the exact second Barr's authority cracked, slowed down, and remixed with booming sound effects or triumphant music. YouTube compilations labeled it "The Day Crockett Ended Barr." Late-night comedians wasted no time. One quipped, Barr said, "That's enough." But Crockett said, "That's not even the beginning." Audiences roared. On cable news, commentators dissected the moment like analysts breaking down game tape. CNN framed it as a generational clash between the old guard of power and a rising tide of unflinching truth. MSNBC went further, calling it a cultural reset for accountability in politics. Even overseas outlets picked it up, with headlines in London, Toronto, and Sydney describing Crockett as the Congresswoman who silenced silence itself. And while Barr's allies tried to spin the exchange as grandstanding, their talking points fell flat. The footage told the story for them. A red-faced man pounding a desk, and a calm, steady woman dismantling him with nothing but words. The contrast was undeniable, and America knew who had won. But the reactions went deeper than applause. Social media threads filled with people sharing their own stories of being told, "That's enough," in classrooms, workplaces, and family gatherings. Women, immigrants, and people of color echoed the same sentiment. "I felt that moment in my soul." Crockett's stand wasn't just her on it, it became a stand-in for millions who had been silenced, dismissed, or shouted down. On TikTok, a teacher posted, "Every time I was told to stop speaking up, I remember this clip. Thank you, Representative Crockett," showing us that enough is never enough when it comes to truth. That video alone racked up over 3 million views. Hashtags morphed into movements. Activists began using hashtag THATS, enough, as a rallying cry against censorship, inequality, and abuse of power. Meanwhile, Barr's image crumbled. Editorial cartoons depicted him as a towering figure reduced to rubble by a single truth-laden phrase. Even some conservative pundits admitted privately that he had overplayed his hand. The once unshakable bulldog of Washington looked more like a relic. Struggling to adapt to a world where yelling no longer silenced dissent, the cultural turning point was clear. This wasn't just about one clash in one chamber. It was about a shift in what America wanted from its leaders. Old power defined by bluster, dominance, and intimidation had met new truth, defined by clarity, conviction, and authenticity. And in this battle, new truth had won. Clips of the moment weren't just being shared, they were being taught. Civics teachers slipped it into lessons. Pastors quoted Crockett's words in Sunday sermons. Organizers played it on loudspeakers at rallies. What had begun as an attempt to shut her down had transformed into a chorus of voices rising louder than ever. And yet, as the applause, the memes, and the celebration spread, a deeper current was stirring beneath it all. Because this wasn't just about Barr losing his temper or Crockett winning a viral exchange. It was about something larger, a lesson America couldn't afford to ignore. Yet behind the applause, a bigger lesson was demanding attention. When the noise of applause and viral celebration began to settle, Crockett did what few expected. She did not gloat. She didn't bask in Barr's humiliation or revel in the flood of memes painting her as the victor. Instead, she leaned into the silence that followed, a silence Barr had once tried to force on her, and reframed the moment for what it truly was. "This was never about me shouting back," she began. Her tone even, her words deliberate. It was about refusing to let truth be silenced. The chamber hushed again, as if realizing the confrontation was not ending in spectacle, but in a lesson. She reminded everyone that silencing voices has always been the oldest trick in the book of power. From congressional hearings to courtroom battles, from protests on the street to dinner tables across America, those with authority have long used the command to stop speaking as a way of maintaining control. Barr's bark of "that's enough" was just the latest echo of that same pattern, and echo she refused to let stand unchallenged. Her words swelled with conviction. Dignity cannot be silenced. Truth cannot be silenced. Not by a gavel, not by a title, not by a shout. In that declaration, the clash became bigger than two figures at odds. It became a reflection of America's ongoing struggle over who gets to be heard and who gets erased. The contrast between her and Barr stood out in sharp relief. He had embodied the old order, red-faced, pounding the desk, trying to drown out dissent with volume and force. She embodied the new, steady, rooted, and armed not with bluster, but with clarity. He represented power, insisting on its own authority. She represented dignity, insisting on truth's endurance. For many watching, the lesson sank deep. Crockett's response wasn't about matching fury with fury, but about transcending it. She showed that strength isn't always in the volume of the voice, but in the resolve behind it. That power built on silencing others is fragile. Power built on authenticity endures. The emotional crescendo of her words reached beyond the chamber. Teachers replayed them to inspire students who felt overlooked. Parents shared them with children who struggled to find confidence in their own voices. Workers replayed them on phones during breaks, reminding themselves that they, too, deserved to be heard. She became a mirror for millions who had been told enough too many times, enough speaking, enough questioning, enough existing loudly. And in her stand, they saw that there was no such thing as enough truth. The arc of the duel was now complete. Barr's attempt to shut her down had backfired spectacularly, exposing the hollowness of arrogance. Crockett's refusal to yield transformed into a lesson larger than herself, a reminder that America is not defined by those who shout loudest, but by those who hold steady when silence is forced upon them. And yet, even as the chamber moved on, and the headlines framed the moment as a cultural clash for the ages, one haunting question lingered in the air. It pulsed through living rooms, classrooms, and comment sections. And for millions watching, one haunting question remained. Who do we trust with America's voice? Barr's shout still echoes in memory. "That's enough." A command meant to end the conversation, to reassert dominance, to close the book before truth had its chance to speak. But as history showed in that chamber, it was Jasmine Crockett who held the final word. It was her voice, not his roar, that reverberated across the nation. If you felt that surge of justice when she refused to be silenced, you weren't alone. Millions across America felt it too. From living rooms to classrooms, from subway rides to dinner tables, people recognized the power of one woman standing her ground against authority that thought it could simply shut her down. In Crockett's steadiness, audiences found a reflection of their own battles, their own moments of being told enough, and their own hope that dignity could still prevail. And this is where you come in. Stories like this don't just belong to politicians or judges. They belong to every person who values truth over bluster, fairness over arrogance, and courage over control. If this moment resonated with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and be part of a growing movement that insists voices cannot be silenced. Together, we amplify not just Crockett's reply, but every reply that rises against the command to stop speaking. Because in the end, this wasn't just a debate. It wasn't just about one outburst in a hearing room. It was a reminder, sharp, powerful, unforgettable, of who truly speaks for America. And as long as voices like Crockett's refuse to yield, the answer will never belong to those who shout others down. It will belong to those who speak truth and refuse to be silenced.